Hello, everybody, at this Monday evening to start the autumn series of the GPM City Dialogues. GPM is the Global Parliament of Mayors and is a platform that is empowering, that is fighting or organizing or lobbying for empowering cities. And my name is Eric Correin. I'm a professor in urban studies at Brussels University, and I serve in GPM as the Director Policy and Research. And I will be your moderator for this evening. And we decided to have a series of webinars each last Monday of the month. So you can already note that down in your agendas. Each last Monday of the month at 5 o'clock Central European Time, we will organize a debate. And today, the subject of our discussion is arts and culture in the urban policy project in cities life. And who can we invite better to discuss that with us than Charles Landry? Hi, Charles.
Hi, Eric. Good to see you.
So Charles is, of course, he's a well-known scholar, but also consultant, animator, discussant in a lot of activities in cities, and he was the initiator, of course, in last century because he has some age. He's a wise man now, and so he really initiated different innovations in the sector of arts and culture in the urban context. Let me start, Charles, welcoming you. And then first question would be, why were you specifically interested in the role of culture and the arts in the first place? What did you mean when you started up with that notion of the creative city? Why is that, in fact?
No, I like that question, Eric, for a number of reasons. Because, as you know, you often do things because it's really a reflection of your own life. So, in terms of the cultural bit, what I was interested in simply, my parents were German. I was born in England. I then went to live in Germany for 9, 10 years. They moved to Italy. I studied in Italy. So you get the idea that I thought, all of these countries are a bit different, but they've all got a specific culture, which I thought was interesting. And I particularly thought it was interesting because sometimes these cultures bump into each other. And where do they mostly bump into each other? Probably a city and a place. So that was really my initial thing. And I kept on thinking that out of all the forms of knowledge that we could have, I studied economics and politics and history. What form of knowledge is the existent or the quintessential form? And so I felt actually cultural literacy, or understanding the cultures of a place and how people are, where they come from, where they might go, given their mindset, seemed really important. So cultural insight was really interesting to me. Then there was another thing about creativity. Why was I interested in creativity? Well, actually, it was quite an interesting thing because my parents were very bohemian and stuff like that. So I was relatively free, whatever that means. We had no money, but you sort of, they weren't bossy and telling us to do this or that. But in my life, early life, I already felt so many people have not got enough capacity, or the environment doesn't let them express themselves enough. So I then really became, how can they be more of themselves? And, 45 years ago, 50 years ago, creativity wasn't such a buzzword. And so I was really interested in the underheard voices, how they got their voice across. So I could have been interested in a psychological way about, what's the problem with Eric? He's not expressing himself well enough, and oh, has he got a problem or is he wonderful or whatever? Then I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't handle that. Then I thought, what about teams and organizations? And I thought, yeah, it's clearly different. Creativity and imagination in an organization is different from individual creativity. But then I thought, actually, the city as a, I don't want to call it capsule, but as a container for all of these cultures coming together, these different people, because the city, by definition, to some extent, is a place where strangers meet. Most of us are always strangers to each other. So I thought the city was, for me, the right focus or the right register, because I could then really grapple with it. It had sort of, when I say boundaries, of course not necessarily physical boundaries, but it was an entity, and it wasn't the whole world. I wasn't talking about the whole world or anything like that. And that made it easier for me to simply get involved in this. And a long time ago, in 1993, with someone called Franco Bianchini, we wrote a little book which was called The Creative City, which was really then connecting to the arts. So why, obviously what I've said so far is culture in the biggest, wider sense. Who are we in a place? What is this place like? What is Antwerp like? What is Bologna like? But then I felt, out of all the expressions of a culture, clearly the art forms, as we all know and everybody in the audience knows, are some of the most powerful ones. And so that led me in a long trajectory about looking at that, assessing it, and making a connection which initially was relatively rare. It's now common practice, which was connecting culture, broadly seen, culture narrowly seen, what's the expression, creativity, and the development of the city together. And that was obviously in Europe, as everybody in this room knows. There were dramatic transformations happening, emblematic places which we associate with this movement of transformation using arts and culture are, for example, just Glasgow as an example, and so on. So that gives you a bit of
Glasgow,
an idea.
cultural capital of Europe in 90, to specify, yes.
That's a very good point, and that was really, I'm really glad you mentioned that, Eric, because there are a series of places which did that very well. I mean, you obviously are aware of Antwerp's "Can Art Save the World?" I think their slogan was. Um, Glasgow was the first city, I think we could say, that really made the most out of that opportunity. Because at the time, people said, this is 1990, and funnily enough, I was working there a lot with them, and they taught me a hell of a lot, Glasgow, the city. I'll explain in a second how. People were saying, Glasgow? City of culture, European city of culture. You must be bloody joking. Was really, I mean, it's difficult to understand now. But what was interesting about Glasgow, I was working then with someone many of you know, partly called Bob Palmer, but particularly with various departments. And what was so interesting about Glasgow, they were so demanding. And because they were so demanding, I didn't like it. It was horrible because they said, "Ugh." But it allowed me to develop a method that really helped me about how you see, and this we're now talking about culture narrowly. I developed a method of how the value chain of culture can be seen. Are there the requirements to enable people to feel empowered to express themselves? How can you transform that into products? How can you distribute it and so on? And how then can you create a discussion culture? And that model I still even use, and I often talk about it as a sort of circle. So Glasgow was important to me, I must say. Plus, later on, very shortly afterwards, Barcelona, where I was able to use the lessons that I'd learnt from Glasgow in collaboration with Barcelona to outline, anyway, let's call it a strategy for the city.
Yeah. Maybe we have to specify for the audience a bit the period you were working in. You speak about the 80s, the 90s, when that started. I know you wrote in your education a dissertation on the post-industrial society. And part of all that was, of course, the decline of the industrial country as such, and then the cities looking for revitalization through more services, more art, more And it's probably in that context that this whole Franco Bianchini, who we both know, Palmer, etc., really worked. What can art and culture change to a declining urban industry and replace that to a post-industrial development? And you were one of the pioneers in thinking that.
No, you're completely right, and thank you for reminding us of that because that was a moment, as you've just said. You went from, I don't know, you know, towards brain power, as some people talked about. It's all about knowledge economy, and they had these words: the knowledge city, the innovative city. All of these words came up, and that's precisely why it was interesting. The period was interesting, and it included also London. We were working a lot in London because and that was a pioneer, London, by the way, in thinking through this. Met many people, their names like Nick Garnham, they might mean nothing to you, but they are important. Or Jeff Mulgan did a lot of work, Kent Warpole. These are all interesting people. And what basically was happening, if we just take Glasgow as an example, it is the classic of this. You thought of shipbuilding and things like that, and then Sheffield got involved, and of course, other cities like Rotterdam and so on and so on. Uh, and that is the context. And so, what was happening partly initially, some people would say, "Oh, what's all this fluffy stuff? This is all vague. What are you talking about?" But there was a very clear moment, and of course, this is international what I'm talking about, but I'm just giving a couple of British examples when the British government heard and noted that the exports of the music industry in Britain were bigger than those of the car industry, some policymakers thought, this is perhaps quite interesting. The second major move in this period, which was very important, was to see the different elements together, that somehow graphic design, music, and technology and all of these things, the visualization of things hung together, which then historically was called the cultural industries. I preferred that phrase myself because it had something to do with identity and stuff like that. Then there was a lot of argument about it, and others said, oh, it should be the creative industry, which I think is a bit problematic because there are lots of interesting creative people in social affairs, in urban activism as well. But let's not continue on that line. So it was quite a fervent moment. But I think we also have to remember, and there was also another person who much later made the distinction very helpfully, which is John Holden, who reminded us that there are three ways of looking at culture because people were saying, oh, what are you doing? People like Charles Landry and others perhaps listening here, just talking about instrument, economics and stuff like that. There's something deeper about culture which has nothing to do with that. And I think today, looking back, we can say there are three helpful ways of looking at it. There's the intrinsic value of culture. I'm doing it because I'm doing it. I'm not immediately thinking, is it good for health and well-being or whatever, sustainability? There's the
Art
instrumental
for the
way.
sake of art, you could say. Is that the?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That's a better
yeah,
way of putting it. Arts
yeah,
for art's sake.
yeah.
I'm only using John Holden's words because they all start with an I. Intrinsic, instrumental, institutional. I mean, you know I'm playing around,
Yeah.
Eric. But the instrumental, obviously, arts and image, arts and tourism.
Mm.
And then the third is what is the institutional value, for example, of a library? And I think that's all interesting. But Eric, I'm sure you've got a lovely question for me or a comment.
No, but I mean, so I think we first have to underline the changing context of society that brought about all this thinking. But it had also an effect on your and our in general thinking about the position of art and culture in society. Because of course, in those days, you could say art and culture was a sector within the national identity, with musea, schools, artists that had to make, let's say, the storyline of the country and of the commonality in the country. And what you were, in fact, how would I say, deconstructing at that time with the shift to the city, is that arts and culture in itself were going to change nature. In fact, you wrote after your book, The Creative City, you have this very important book also, the intercultural city, where in fact the intoxication of multicultural, of different cultures in an urban context, produces something else. Maybe you have to elaborate a bit on that.
Well, no, that was exactly, and that's I'm glad you're focusing on that because, as I said at the very beginning, my own background is a bit sort of mixed. So I was already open to the idea of intercultural because I always kept on thinking to myself, okay, it's all fine that, let's say, Indians come from Uganda and all move to Leicester. But isn't it more interesting what that Indian person does with someone from Ireland or a British person who happens in Leicester? So that was just a thought I always carried with me. What happens when we mix up things? So we made for us what was then my main aim in focusing on the intercultural idea, which was not really, it wasn't really one of these words that was used, was to shift from multiculturalism to interculturalism. Multiculturalism, as the audience knows, is really, yes, we celebrate our difference. I'm celebrating that our friends here, I can see some of them are German, okay, and then some of them are Belgian or Flemish, etc. That's all fine. What do we do together? Now, one of in that research, which ultimately was a 5-year project and then led to the Council of Europe
Is
setting up
that the intercultural city, planning
correct
for
the inter
diversity dividend, or
yeah, the book,
yeah.
you're always making very good interventions, Eric. It's very helpful. Uh, it is called The Intercultural City,
Yeah.
Planning for Diversity Advantage.
Uh,
And what we were saying is, I realize, you realize, we realize when an influx of people comes into the city who come from elsewhere, and then there are locals, whatever you call locals, or who've been there a long time, that can create stress. We understand that. If they have different habits, we understand all of that. Do they treat women in the same way as others do, and so on? So we're not all saying it's rosy, but the general idea of the creative city, as many in the audience know, is really let's take a glass half full approach. We know there is a problem, of course. So, therefore, that subtitle, Planning for Diversity Advantage. Now, what we discovered was really great for us when we looked at companies and the private sector and stuff like that, and what teams were most effective. And I'm focusing now for the moment on economic things. Those teams, those companies that had mixed teams tended to be more profitable in a very crude way, I'm being very crude, than ones that just had a singular view. So that influenced us also in terms of the city, because I don't want to talk about the obvious things that, lots of new food came in, you have more restaurants and stuff like that, gastronomy. But there are other issues. What else can we learn? And so that's the difference, perhaps, between that and the nation. And I know your key phrase, Eric, is a city is not a nation, a country rather, a city is not a country. And in that sense, it's completely true because the density, as we know, of mixed groups of people who come from different backgrounds, of course, is substantially higher in a city. Therefore, what do we do? Shall we all be ghettoized? Okay, because I'm probably too liberal and think, oh, isn't it all nice if we get together? I'm not so interested in the ghetto.
mm,
I'm more interested in doing something together with someone who's from Nigeria or whatever. And that's just, you could say I'm naive, but this is much more likely to happen. But of course, I don't need to tell you that people then become basically racist and they don't like them because they just look different, they eat different food and so on. So that is the specific challenge of the city. For me, still, and I'm glad you mentioned the subtitle, can we plan for an advantage for diversity? Given that we know there are problems, but
and
we look at it positively.
what is your assessment then of the situation? Because because of course you can indicate rightly so the advantages of mixing and of combining best parts of different cultures or different approaches. And so let's say take a position in favor of hybridity, mixity. But at the other hand, we know that most of the cities still have neighborhoods, communities, that a lot of people in cities do not necessarily leave their community and stay in the multi of the cultures and not the inter. So
Yeah,
it
yeah. I
is it
mean,
is
we know that happens. I mean, what we obviously that in that work researched, of course, was the reason why people. Look, obviously, if someone's coming from Somalia and they've got some horrible situation there, of course they're going to see, have I got a relative who lives in Tower Hamlets or somewhere? And of course they tend to agglomerate together. All of these things are completely natural. What then happens, of course, as you well know, these then become portal places, the portal places, which will be different in each country. And then some of those people who become, let's call it more middle class or better off, they might then spread and then not be only with their group. But the fact of only being with your group, I think is in a sense problematic for me because I'm really interested in, I mean, I'm using a cliched phrase, the dialogue of difference. I just want to know because I'm curious what other people do, what do they do in their private life. I'm just interested in that.
yeah,
I mean, you can say again, I'm naive because I just want to know about other people. Uh, but therefore, because the tendency can be to ghettoize, we need to find when I say convenings, public space and placemaking becomes an incredibly significant thing. Now, historically, when cities were perhaps more contained, the city centre was the neutral territory where difference met in a city. Again, that's fractured a lot, but you would see the main library there, the main institutions, and you would gather there. A celebration would be there as well as a protest or something, and so these differences from the city would meet. That's become much more difficult for all sorts of reasons, cities spreading out and so on. So, given that that has to be constructed to some extent, uh, city policymakers, I believe, should be conscious about that and try to create contexts where we can do that. So I'll give you an example of a festival which I always admire. Robin Archer, brilliant festival maker from Australia, and she did a thing. Her whole thing for 2 weeks was let's dance. It was an intercultural project, but she didn't say intercultural.
no,
In the
no,
main square, Federation Square, every night there was a different form of music. So initially there were, 100 people, and then in the end there were 2,000 people. And of course, then that's how people met, sort of serendipitously and stuff like that. So in trying to bond, we can be sometimes, I'm sure the audience knows the British expression, holier than thou. They're saying, it's about time you met someone from a different culture. Often it works better when, is it the thing you like? Do you like the music? And then you work out later. And in our research on the intercultural city, we found two of the most powerful reasons instances where people connect. One was being at the doctor's surgery or the dentist. If you're black and I'm white and both of our kids have got toothache, the main thing is toothache. The
no,
other one where we found very powerful connections was the military. Particularly, there's quite a few studies in America that intercultural families met in the military because the main target was your job in relation to being in a military job. I'm just saying these things are retrospectively obvious, but sometimes interculturality happens just en passant, like
yes,
that. Let's
yeah.
dance.
But that relates you to, let's say, to the politics of the city, urban planning, and because you seem to be in favor then to, I mean, to take initiatives. You mentioned that dance initiative, and not just to leave the physical space organize our interaction, but to intervene with cultural and artistic means and create a kind of software of the public space.
I
And
completely agree. You're completely sorry. Yes, I do agree with that. I think you do too, but that's a different question.
uh, uh,
Yes, of course, I think that you need to guide in a way. You're not prescriptive, but I've just been last a few days ago at Placemaking Europe, which many of you know about, and we were talking about places, and obviously because it's placemaking.
yeah,
Um, but the point is that how place is organized either brings people together or doesn't. I mean, or makes them more likely to come together than less likely. Now, shopping centers, classic shopping centers, okay, you can hang out there, but I'm not sure it brings people together. So you really have to think very carefully how that space is organized. And within that, obviously, programming is key. Now, one of the main differences, and because I know you speak Spanish, is that difference between conviviality, which, of course, when I'm talking, I'm sort of saying, I wish we could be together, convivere, live together, be together, which sounds very cozy. And it is cozy when it happens, and we're all convivial and we're all drinking a glass of wine, or I don't know what we're doing, versus convivencia. Now, convivencia, as you know, is the Portuguese word for conviviality. Now, in Brazil, in particularly, convivencia is has a slightly different inflection, and this is a public space issue, and it's the central issue as far as I'm concerned. By the way, an interesting guy called Tommy Laitio highlighted that for me, just in brackets, just to recognize him. And convivencia means it's a bit like a Christmas party. I'm doing the Christmas party Christian one. And you're there, you have to go with your family, or you feel you should. And you don't really like that aunt of yours, but you have to be friendly, yeah? Or you think the uncle is really horrible and difficult. But in that context, you share that celebration. Now, transferring that to public space, that is one of the central issues, because I'm just stereotyping, if you don't mind.
you
You've
know,
got some young guys who are doing skateboarding, hypothetically. There could be women doing skateboarding, as you know, but let's just stereotype. And they're being whatever they are. And then you've got some older women sitting there who are just having a chat because they're widows. Right. How do they together share that space? Now,
mm,
that's not a Nigerian and a Belgian, but it's just sort of people from different age groups. But it's just talking about the diversity of people who are in public space. And this is a wonderful challenge, I think. I don't know. There isn't a rocket science to say you must do this or you must do that, but you have to work on it. And you know as well as I know that this is about building trust between generations. And I think what's really interesting, my latest obsession is intergenerational solidarity, by the way. I'm doing a project on that. That's partly because I'm old and the people I'm working with are very young. But this is why you have to work at it. It doesn't just happen.
yeah. But that brings us to, I mean, if I understand it well, that that's placemaking and especially, let's say, using art and culture to let's say accompany the social practices in those places seem for you then one of the cornerstones of cultural policies in cities. It is not
Yeah, it's
just
one of the cornerstones. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Do
But
you have
basically, what exactly?
any other accent that the urban governance should include in its cultural or artistic governance? Or
Well, the first thing for me, and I'm being a bit definitional now,
yeah,
is if I'm doing a talk, I'm tending to say there is a difference between cultural planning and planning culturally. That works in English
okay,
because
yeah,
what it's saying in English, at least English, I don't know what it's in Flemish, it means that I'm understanding, I have cultural literacy, so I'm understanding who this place is in all its inflections and differences. So the first thing I would say, ideally, a city understands that distinction, and that cultural planning is the manifestation of things having thought about that, which may be an activity, it may be a physical thing, or not. Personally, I think one of the main cornerstones of a cultural policy is there's a whole series of things. If you're talking about cultural policy, there's Dorothy Scott Hansen once said, cultural policy is empowerment, engagement, education, and stuff like that. And I then added a few more E's. So I think a great cultural policy actually has a lot of these E's, from experience to education to, other words beginning with E that don't come into my mind. I've got seven of them. Now, when I then break that down, what does that mean? I think one of the important things about cultural policy is, and this comes back to my history, making underheard voices heard.
Yeah,
I mean, if I say, what have you been doing all your life? I would say that has been my life's project. Sorry, I'm not trying to sound so holy and wonderful, but that's really what I'm on about. And that's what I mean by creativity, harnessing, enabling, and
yeah,
stuff like that. So another policy is to enable people to be of their best.
yeah.
I mean, that's a
That's
second.
all very clear, but I know for a few years you are very interested in bureaucracies. Are your bureaucrats ready for such cultural approaches, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some cities uh, which I think understand this. I mean, we've got a friend in the audience who used to work very heavily with Mannheim, and I think they broadly understood that. Um, uh, I think a lot of what we're talking about is actually acknowledging that culture in all its manifestation is at the same level as economics or other forms, and so on, you know, uh, because well, are they ready? Are they ready? More no than yes, because it does imply various things. Because it's always easier, I don't need to tell you, for someone to get 10 million euros together. I'd say I'm going to build a building, and then, have you got the money to do something with the building? So what's more important, the hardware or the software, is another way of putting this. And I would say that that is really the difficulty. And even though, people like you and me and others in the audience have been arguing about this for a very long time, there's still a hell of a long way to go. We're still arguing for these approaches. Whereas clearly, if you just did an economic calculation of a series of young folks who are being not very nice, and the cost of putting them in some institution or something, which might be X amount of euros, versus doing a program around this, it's one of the cheapest, or a cheaper way of doing things. And unfortunately, people don't make that sort of calculation.
Okay, so let's maybe summarize a bit. So you started off in the post-industrial transition thinking, and you're one of the innovators, in fact, in pointing at the importance or the growing importance of art and culture, imagination in general, to change the, let's say, the imagination, and more specifically in cities, which are multicultural, which are diverse ways of living together, and not, let's say, the myth of the national identity in the same way. Then you worked a lot, of course, we have discussed different things, but in fact, as I understand, you stress the importance in urban policies of looking to bridging diversity, bridging differences, using the strong points of difference much more than monocultural expression. But now I come to another question and domain. Do we have the artists, and are artistic and cultural practices at the level you wanted them to be. Because I see a lot of sectors and silos and traditional ways of behaving, and the painters in their galleries and the players in their theaters. What have we to change in artistic or cultural practices to
Well,
live up to your expectations?
well, it's interesting. Perhaps I hope I'm answering a bit your question. I was asked recently to do an article about or a foreword to a book about art in outdoors, i.e., not inside a building.
Mm,
And so it really led me to think through, and I was thinking through what experiences have I had about this that have, had an effect. And I think in principle we probably do, but then you come to the bureaucracy. Will the bureaucracy fund these things that we're talking about? I'm just giving you one that was 10, 12 years ago, which was in Bilbao. And I suddenly, this is ideal actually, because it was in front of the Guggenheim. And suddenly there were 50 bodies or 80 bodies lying there, all in red, which was effectively blood, which were, sorry, because I know you've written a book about bullfighting, about anti-bullfighting. So this was clearly
yeah,
a political statement that they were making, and apparently that had a major effect. So in the outdoor, I mean, the point is, we all talk about, Kunst für alle, art for all, or work culture for all these words we use. There is always a threshold in institutions. So I'm always interested. I don't know what the word is. What are they? Liminal places? You know the words better.
yeah,
These
yeah,
places in between inside and outside. So my domain, not domain, the area I find most interesting is where this happens. So that you have something in the outside, and ideally what's in the inside is interesting, that lures you into it. So I'll give you an example of a project I did a consultancy for a long time ago, or did the concept, and then it became to me far too traditional, which was called Rich Mix, and it was a word I actually, created. I said, let's set this centre up, call it Rich Mix,
yeah,
and I said the way we should organise it didn't happen like this because it was then organized so traditionally, was we start with the easy. We start with food. Didn't you know that this cooking woman from India is fantastic and we all have her cookbook? Oh, she's doing a cooking lesson. And then we go into the room further and further in, and then towards the inside, we talk about really difficult issues like, are you more sexist or are you more racist? No, I'm being silly, but you see what I'm saying.
yeah,
So
yeah.
you go from the easy to the difficult. Now, all of that, to some extent, needs curating. So you need different sort of curators. You need the artist, you need the generals, general in the sense of they know the logistics,
Hmm.
and you need choreographers. So I believe it's you need really sort of interesting mixes to do interesting projects, is
Yeah.
my view.
So in that sense, I mean, urban cultural policies is not an easy trade. In fact, it is you have to detraditionalize the sectors of arts and culture. It's not easy. You cannot just take them as they have been built
Correct, in my
over
view.
the years in the country. You have to transform them in a certain way as to adapt them to the specific diversity of your own city.
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right. I mean, most institutions, cultural institutions, are relatively well, they've been roughly as they are. And, that doesn't mean that all art galleries should go or anything like that, but it would be good if some were a bit exploratory. Um, I mean, I'm just thinking a bit on my feet, but I think we know about outreach. In Britain, for example, there's been hundreds of outreach programs. Okay, that's good. Art for all, get people involved and all of that. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, but it's again, sorry, I'm sounding a bit sort of simplistic, but there has to be a bit of a balance. And what is really important for me in cultural policy making is, and especially since art budgets are under pressure, is that the innovative budget there isn't really an innovation budget. Do you see what I'm saying? Because it's all mostly gone to existing entities, whereas there should be quite an element which is an exploratory budget, which also allows the new. When you look at most budgets in most cities, they're already preset at the beginning of the year. Sorry, this is all a bit
Yeah, yeah,
pedantic what I'm talking about now, but this is the reality of what happens, which why some people who feel they've got something to say are frustrated because the system reduces the innovative effect, I think.
yeah. Just for the audience, if you really want to intervene or raise a question, you have to use the chat box or the Q&A, because we don't have any questions, so we are filling up the conversation, the two of us. So as long as there are no questions raised by the audience, I want to go to maybe a very difficult part of the questioning. So we have discussed the necessity of conviviality, coaching that. You need to curate that, so it's not an automatic interaction, and we need artistic and policy interventions or coaching to do that. And that brings, let's say, maybe opening up communities to get acquainted with the other, and not to be to get to grow confidence. Now, one of the questions I have is, once that happens, you have maybe a better conviviality in your city, but do these people become also citizens of the city, interested in co-producing the decisions,
Ah,
in fueling democracy, because maybe they feel better, but for the rest, they may be staying in their community, in their religion, or in their specific subgroup of the society, whereas, of course, the complexity of the city needs also democratic planning in a certain way. Could you maybe reflect
well,
on
I
that?
mean, this is a topic that you've thought about a lot, and I think it's a very important topic. And there is no automatic, I mean, I may be wrong because you really thought about this very strongly. I do not believe there is an automatic flip from, oh, I'm now getting on with you, Eric, because you're Belgian, and then I become suddenly an engaged citizen. I do not personally
Yeah,
think that automatically happens. So, to some extent, that building citizenship, which is essentially what you're saying,
yeah.
is a project. And of course, it's a cultural project because what then happens if it's successful, it is a new culture. It obviously has that original locality in it. It is slightly affected by these new nuances or whatever and impulses. But so my simple answer is no. I do. I personally don't think it's automatic.
Mm,
It has to be engendered. Now I'm back to the point: is how can I get someone to be engaged? Is the central question to me. How do you get someone to be engaged in anything? Yeah,
mm,
and to be feel responsible for the future of the place. I think that's such a bloody interesting question, which I don't know the answer to, but I'll just
mhm,
say to some extent what's on the top of my head. Um, we're back to the way I talked about the project, the festival, which says let's dance. Now, there is something just coming into my mind which I thought was successful, and I once spoke at it, was called the Biennale Democrazia in Torino.
mhm,
And in that, there were all these fantastic imagery of they had. It was yellow and then black, the writing, and I'm doing these big things, but there were these big things everywhere in the city, which and you people say, "What a festival of democracy? I can't believe it." But that sort of event, which I would say is a cultural event, it's a cultural event because it had all the qualities, certainly in terms of organizing, how you organize a festival, all the same elements. Can I get the people in the audience? Can they come in? Can the experience be good? Will the different people who are talking, can I curate this? So I think that is one example where you could do something. I myself, copying the word Biennale, developed something, and unfortunately, the war in Ukraine happened, called the Biennale of Trust.
Yeah.
And what I would say, what we did there was a cultural event. We had academic people talking about trust. You know, trust's not an easy concept. Don't ask me what is trust exactly. Um, but we then had things like we went to the KGB headquarters of Western Ukraine, had ex-KGB people talking about media freedom. We had a very large collective lunch in some old train station where people had to bring food. So basically, what you see, what we were trying to do is orchestrate stuff that people would speak to each other. What was relevant in the Ukraine was that, of course, social capital under communism was relatively low. And so this notion of being together was quite important. But particularly, what I was concerned with, because there was a series of business people who brought me to the Ukraine who were incredibly trustworthy. And the image of the Ukraine was that it is utterly corrupt. So for me, it was partly trying to do a switch. So it's
Mhm.
not fully, the two examples I'm giving you are not full answers to your question because 100 other things need to be happening. You know, the obvious thing is school and all of that. But that's just a bit of a gut response. I
Yeah.
don't know if you find that
No, no,
moderately
I think,
interesting.
but I mean, we are heading to the end of our conversation. I noted, in fact, how would I say, three levels that we discussed in good urban cultural policy making. Is on the one hand, you insist on documenting the different existing cultures. You said let the unheard speak,
Voices be
or
heard, yeah.
make them visible. So which means that multicultural should be documented in your city. Secondly, insist on bridging differences, and making an intercultural dialogue, pacifying and then thirdly, relating the narrative that is found on the bridge, you could say, to link that to citizenship and to involvement in democracy and co-decision. Would you agree with these
I
three
agree.
levels?
Yeah, I agree. You've summarized that very well. I mean, a word you've used a couple of times, which is really so much. Sorry, I'm going to say something stupid. Because I'm born on the 1st of July, I always feel that's the middle of the year. So I have to bridge left and right, up and down, plus and minus. So bridging is a big thing for me. Um, but I agree with you. The issue I have most difficulty with, perhaps I haven't thought about it enough, is the one of how do you get someone. I can imagine how someone feels they are part of the city just emotionally. You know, I like the city. I like that place because that's the first kiss I gave to someone. So this is meaningful to me. All of that sort of stuff. That I can mentally handle and can see it. I still have that problem of how that then leads to engagement and commitment that the person acts.
Mhm.
Now, I can see that in terms of subsectors like sustainability. You know, the way someone suddenly becomes conscious of sustainability often is there's suddenly a flood. Yeah. And they said there's no floods here. And suddenly, well, there must be climate change going. I can suddenly see it. You know, I've noticed that in my local area. If you take mobility, which I've thought quite a lot about, believe it or not, is there's a lot of examples about mobility. You know, could we have shared mobility? We use less cars. Could we have electric bikes? Could we have this? Could we have that? Now, where is the tipping point? And who is the city looking at the totality of all the innovations in mobility, which then you suddenly see, my God, if they were all talking to each other, there would be a shift, and people would suddenly say, I know my main instinct is it money? I'll only flip if it saves me money, or if it saves me time, or if it's more convenient. These are all true. But you might say, to get people committed, you might say, make driving a car so difficult that the last thing you want to do is to drive a car, like Copenhagen did, yeah? So I'm just saying, what are the triggers that gets people to want to engage in something? And I believe it is mostly convenience, time, and money, but can also be shared mobility things, often because you have to communicate with someone else, become, I don't want to use this big word, social cohesion, but you're beginning to connect with neighbors. So I'm really interested in finding devices that force you, I know that sounds a bit manipulative, force you to connect with your neighbor. Because I believe once you connect with your neighbor and you suddenly see, again, this sounds so wishy-washy, we're all human beings and all of that, at least that you're on the starting block.
Uh, Well, we are at the end of our conversation, Charles Landry. I want to thank you for that. I hope we inspired the audience who didn't raise any questions, so that's why we filled the whole hour. That we inspired them to position art and culture more in the center of urban policy and city making. That is what a lot of your texts have argued so forcefully. So art and culture is not, let's say, the last sector as amusement for the population, but is central in re-imaging the complexity of the city, and you have contributed a lot to that. And the people in the audience interested have to Google you up. There is a lot of interesting material to read there and to learn about you. Thank you very much for your contribution. And for our webinars, I repeat, every last Monday of the month we will be with you. So the next time is the 27th of October, and then we are going to discuss caring cities, compassionate cities. How can cities care more for their population and maybe solve some of the problems of the decline of the welfare state that are arriving in the city? That will be our topic. Charles Landry, thank you very much for this interesting conversation.
And thank you for your questions, Eric. No, that's great.
Bye, everybody. See you next
Bye.
month again.